Please. Sleep with my daughter. The sentence dropped into the darkness like a weapon. Heavy. Final. Unmistakable. Before Sergeant Ethan Cole could even react, the man, starved, dust-covered, trembling from days spent hiding under shattered beams, placed both hands on his adult daughter's shoulders, and pushed her toward him. She didn't flinch, didn't resist, didn't lift her head. She simply stood there, an adult woman wrapped in clothes that looked more like ash than fabric, her body held in that stiff, suspended posture of someone who had forgotten what safety feels like. Her fingers curled tightly around each other, knuckles pale, breath unsteady, as if she were bracing for a future she no longer believed she had any control over. Her eyes stayed glued to the dirt near Ethan's boots. Not once did she look up. Not once did she try to meet his gaze. The father bowed so deeply his spine seemed to fold in on itself. "It's everything I have left to offer," he whispered. "Please." And in that cramped, broken shelter beneath the ruins of Okinawa, Ethan Cole understood the truth. This wasn't about corruption or desire or anything close to it. This was war grinding a family so far into desperation that they had forgotten the shape of dignity itself. Stories like this aren't loud. They don't make the headlines. They live in the cracks, where humanity trembles but doesn't completely die. If you want more forgotten chapters like this, the ones that hit harder the quieter they get, consider subscribing. Not for me. But so these shadows from the past don't disappear again. Okinawa was no longer an island, it was a wound, open, raw, and bleeding into the Pacific air. By the spring of 1945, what had once been a place of fishermen, schoolyards, and quiet hillside paths had transformed into the bloodiest battlefield of the entire Pacific War. Smoke drifted through the valleys like a second sky. Houses were crushed into piles of stone pretending to still be homes. 1/3 of the island's people were already gone, not as soldiers but as civilians. Families caught between the merciless grind of artillery and the terror of occupation. Those who survived hid in caves, tombs, or holes carved out of collapsing earth, clutching the last scraps of food, praying through nights that never truly ended. Into this ruin, American foot soldiers advanced with orders that contradicted everything they'd been trained for. They were taught to fight, but now they were told to protect. As U.S. troops pushed inland, command briefings shifted. Safeguard civilians, pull the terrified from caves, offer water and mercy wherever possible. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. had emphasized restraint, insisting that unnecessary harm to Okinawans wasn't just immoral, it would cripple the mission. So young Americans, clerks, welders, farmhands, found themselves carrying not just rifles but canteens meant for strangers. They learned to see fear not merely as danger, but as a sign of someone who might need help. Yet nothing in their training prepared them for civilians who had been told that surrender meant torture, mutilation, or worse. The men tried anyway, fumbling through gestures of comfort while the thunder of war echoed behind them. Deep beneath a demolished village, the Nakamura family had survived 12 days in a half-collapsed shelter. Their home had disappeared under shell fire, leaving only shattered beams and memory. In that dark space lived the father, the mother, and their adult daughter, rationing a failing water jug and a handful of rice kernels. The mother grew sick early, fever first, then the coughing brutal and constant. There was no medicine, no clean water, nothing but the father's desperation and the daughter's silent endurance. Every breath the mother fought for sounded like it was pulled through broken glass. The father tried wet cloths, whispered prayers, holding her upright through the night, but war has never cared for devotion. It only takes. By the time Ethan Cole found them, the mother's strength had burned away, leaving the father with that hollow stare, the one carried by people who know loss is no longer a possibility but an appointment. Ethan Cole had grown up far from war's shadow, in a modest Ohio neighborhood where porch lights stayed on and people greeted strangers as if they were halfway to being friends. Before enlisting, he stocked medicine at a drugstore, learning the small comfort of handing someone a cure, even for something as simple as a cough. He wasn't the toughest man in his unit, nor the loudest, but he carried more bandages than bullets, more hope than hate. Like many of his generation, he dreamed of becoming a doctor after the war, a dream the GI Bill kept alive in the back of his mind. Every time he cleaned a wound or calmed a frightened villager, the dream felt less like ambition and more like obligation. He didn't see enemy civilians, he saw people, sick, scared, exhausted people caught in a storm they didn't choose. So when he stepped into the Nakamura's shelter, into the smell of sickness and soil, He didn't recoil. He moved closer, gently lowering his pack, prepared to help, unaware that within minutes the father would collapse to his knees and make the most desperate request Ethan Cole would ever hear in his life. Ethan Cole had never called himself a medic, but in every way that mattered, he was one. In Okinawa, where chaos carved through the hills like a blade, field medics became the quiet lifeline that kept the war from swallowing everyone whole. Ethan didn't wear the red cross on his helmet, but his instincts never wavered. He reached for bandages before bullets, for water before warnings. He believed that every life saved pushed the war a little further away, as if stitching a wound or easing a fever somehow stitched the world back together. While others scanned the horizon for threats, Ethan looked for anyone who might still be breathing, still hoping, still clinging to something worth saving. That impulse didn't begin on Okinawa. It began years before, in the steady rhythms of the American Midwest. Ethan grew up in a Protestant household where Sunday sermons weren't about fear but about service, about lifting the people who fell before you. His parents had clawed their way through the Great Depression, learning that you didn't survive hardship by facing it alone, but by sharing whatever you had: bread, work, dignity. Small-town Ohio in the 1930s was a place where neighbors fixed one another's barns after storms, where a family's misfortune was a community's responsibility. Kindness wasn't something Ethan learned in war. It was something he brought to it. And it shaped every decision he made in those fractured, smoke-filled days on Okinawa. War tested that kindness constantly. U.S. wartime propaganda spoke often about American decency, about fighting honorably even when surrounded by brutality, but Ethan didn't need posters to tell him who to be. He fought the war, but he refused to become it. Survival, to him, meant more than staying alive. It meant staying human. He believed dignity mattered, even when dignity was the first casualty in every direction he looked. When civilians surrendered in terror, flinching as though expecting the worst, Ethan lowered his voice and his hands. When other soldiers cursed the constant strain of caring for villagers who barely trusted them, Ethan answered softly, "That's the job. That's the point." He wasn't naive. He had seen death up close, had watched friends fall, had felt fear grip his spine like a fist. But he never let fear dictate the shape of his character. Which is why, on the day he crawled into the Nakamura's collapsed shelter, the first thing he noticed wasn't the shattered beams or the stench of sickness. It was the trembling breath of a mother who was days away from dying. The father's name, he would later learn, was Kenji. But in that first instant Ethan wasn't thinking about names or nationalities or uniforms. He didn't see enemies. He saw a sick woman whose fever was climbing like fire through dry timber. He saw a man holding his family together by sheer will. He saw an adult daughter kneeling beside her mother, exhausted, hollowed out, yet refusing to look away. All of it pulled Ethan forward, not backward. He set his pack down gently, as though afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace held the family upright. Kenji stared at him with eyes that had forgotten what hope felt like. Yet when Ethan knelt beside the mother, checking her pulse, touching her forehead, whispering a soft reassurance she couldn't understand, the room shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but something else rose beside it, the faint recognition of mercy. Ethan didn't know the Nakamura's story yet. He didn't know how long they had been hiding, how close the mother was to slipping away, or how starvation and sickness had ground the family down until desperation became their only language. All he knew was that a life was fading in front of him, and stopping that mattered more than anything happening outside the ruin. He worked quietly, methodically, letting every gesture say what words could not. "You're safe now. I'm here to help." And long before Kenji knelt in the dirt and made his impossible request, Ethan Cole had already given the family something even rarer than medicine. He had given them the first moment of human kindness they had seen in weeks. Kenji's request did not emerge from madness, nor from cruelty, nor from anything remotely connected to desire. It came from a place far older and heavier, an inherited burden carved into generations of Japanese families long before a single American soldier ever set foot on Okinawa. In his world, a life saved demanded a life's worth of repayment. Ongiri, the old belief that debts of mercy must be balanced with sacrifice, pressed against him like a stone he could not set down. To Kenji, honor weighed more than life, and gratitude wasn't something spoken. It was something given, something surrendered, something painful enough to prove it was real. He knew his wife would not have lived the night without Ethan's medicine. He knew his daughter would not have stood at all without the food Ethan had carried through the smoke and gunfire. In that shattered shelter, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he once called home, Kenji believed he owed Ethan a debt no ordinary gesture could repay. And so the gesture came without words. It lived in the space between breaths, in the tremor of his hands, in the way he stepped forward then bowed as though collapsing under centuries of cultural weight. Civilians across Okinawa had grown used to believing they owed their survival to the mercy of foreign soldiers. Some thanked them quietly. Some avoided them, ashamed of their own helplessness. But Kenji was different. He was a teacher before the war, a man who carried an old-fashioned sense of familial duty like armor. When he pushed his daughter gently toward Ethan, he was offering what he believed was the only currency he had left. He had no food, no possessions, no future to promise. The war had stripped him of every form of wealth except his own willingness to sacrifice for the people he loved. Ethan had survived artillery barrages, ambushes, nights spent crouched in pits of mud and fear. But nothing, no battle, no explosion, no loss, ever broke him the way that moment did. The U.S. Army drilled into its soldiers a strict code against harming civilians, and Ethan held that code closer than any rule he had learned in training. He had built his entire sense of purpose around protecting the powerless, around ensuring that his uniform meant safety, not terror. Yet now he stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to understand how an act of mercy had turned into this impossible crossroads. He wanted to shout, to refuse, to push Aiko gently back toward her father and demand that Kenji take the offer back before it killed him from the inside. He wanted to tell the man that this was wrong, that he hadn't saved the mother to be repaid, that kindness was not a loan but a gift. But then he saw the desperation behind Kenji's eyes, the desperation of a man who believed he had nothing left to prove his gratitude, nothing left to protect his family's honor, nothing left to live for unless he could somehow balance the scales. And Aiko, she stood there with a stillness that struck Ethan harder than any sound could have. 19, maybe 20. A daughter raised in a culture where obedience was the only form of safety left to women, especially in wartime. She wasn't ashamed. She was resigned. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers interlocked until the joints blanched white. Her kimono, carefully brushed of dust despite the wreckage around her, hung loosely on a frame thinned by hunger. She did not raise her head. She did not plead. She did not tremble. She had already understood the choice long before Ethan did. The silence wrapped around them, thick and breathless. Ethan knew she wasn't offering herself. She was offering her family's survival, her father's dignity, her mother's fragile chance at living another day. In a world shattered by war, she had become the last shield her family possessed. And Ethan, who believed so fiercely in the sacredness of every life he touched, found himself facing a moral chasm so wide it felt like the earth itself had split beneath his boots. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know how to breathe. He only knew that whatever he did next would scar every one of them for the rest of their lives. Ethan would remember that night, the way the shelter held its breath, the way shame and fear clung to the air like smoke, as the moment he realized war was fought not only with rifles but in the human heart. Kenji's trembling apology, Aiko's lowered eyes, the darkness pressing in from all sides, it was heavier than any artillery shell, more suffocating than any smoke-filled ruin. Ethan didn't recoil. He knew Kenji's offer wasn't born from lust or cruelty, it was fear shaped by duty, despair pressed into ritual, a father attempting to repay a life debt that could not otherwise be expressed. Cultural misunderstandings were everywhere in this war, yet this was the clearest, most agonizing one Ethan had ever faced. He understood the logic, the desperation, the weight of honor, but he could never accept the act itself. To react with anger, to reject too harshly, would have left Kenji drowning in a shame he could never recover from. Ethan breathed slowly, grounding himself, reminding himself of the code they drilled into every American soldier. Protect civilians, honor dignity, leave no moral wound behind. This wasn't lust. This was despair, and he would not let despair dictate the outcome. He needed a way forward, one that preserved safety, dignity, and humanity. Rejecting Kenji's offer would dishonor the father. Accepting it as intended was unthinkable. So he chose a third path, one unscripted in any field manual, forged purely in the crucible of conscience. He placed a gentle hand on Kenji's shoulder, bowing slightly, a gesture awkward but sincere, and whispered, "I accept your honor." Not the act, not the sacrifice, but the honor itself. In the American moral code, intent often mattered as much as action, and Ethan leaned fully into that principle. He took the gratitude, the gesture, the meaning, but none of the harm. Kenji exhaled as though a heavy weight had lifted. A man returned a piece of his soul, the first release he had felt in days. Aiko remained seated, back straight, hands clasped, bracing against the impossible. Ethan lowered himself to her eye level, letting her not have to look up in fear, and spoke softly, "We're just going to talk, all right?" She did not respond at first, but her shoulders loosened slightly. And so they talked about her mother's illness, about the lingering cold that crept through the wooden walls, about small things he had known before the war. Cornfields back home, church bells ringing on Sunday mornings, the ways people found laughter even in hardship. There was no violence, no demands, only words. Many GIs wrote home about nights like these, when their only weapon was kindness, their only mission to convince a terrified civilian that not every soldier brought destruction. By the time Aiko's eyes softened, the shelter had transformed from a battlefield into a fragile truce, a place where dignity could be maintained despite fear. Ethan protected her dignity as fiercely as she had protected her silence. Morning arrived on a thin ribbon of pale light, slipping across the ruins outside. Kenji waited at the doorway, spine straight but breath shallow, a silent question in his posture. Ethan emerged, calm and composed, and Kenji's eyes filled with the kind of release only a man who has escaped an unspeakable fear can know. He bowed, slowly and deeply, a gesture of reconciliation and gratitude, a debt acknowledged without blood or further harm. Ethan returned the bow, awkward but genuine, and in that shared gesture the father knew some debts are paid not with sacrifice, but with kindness strong enough to survive the war itself. As Ethan stepped away from the small, battered shelter, he understood something new. In a world torn open by violence, decency was not just an American ideal, it was a weapon against darkness, a light that could endure even in the worst night. Ethan didn't leave after that night. He returned to the shelter the following evening, carrying not only more food and clean water but a small cache of antibiotics and bandages scavenged from supply depots along the way. Each item was more than a tool of survival, it was a promise that he would not abandon them, that mercy and decency had a place even here, in the cratered heart of Okinawa. As he knelt beside the mother, he arranged the medicine carefully, instructing Kenji on doses, offering reassurance through gestures when words failed. His hands were steady, precise, and gentle, moving as if he were tending his own family, and the father watched in quiet awe, understanding that the soldier's choice to come back was a choice to shoulder part of their suffering, a pledge that humanity could persist even in war. The mother's fever gradually began to break, her ragged breaths easing, her skin losing the clammy heat of near collapse. Ethan worked with vigilance, monitoring her closely through the night, tending the wounds that infection had begun to claim, guiding Kenji on how to keep her nourished and hydrated. In every action he treated her like his own, quietly insisting that survival was not a transaction but a shared responsibility, a covenant forged in trust. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, the sharpness of her cough softened, and for the first time in days she slept without the tremor of pain rippling through her body. The shelter, once a tomb of fear, felt almost alive again, the sound of breathing no longer frantic but measured and steady. Aiko, who had remained silent through the terror of the previous nights, finally spoke. The words were barely audible, a fragile sound that seemed to tremble out of her chest and through the wooden boards of the shelter. "Thank you," she whispered in perfect Japanese, the syllables precise and reverent. Ethan knelt beside her, offering a reassuring nod, and for a moment the war outside seemed to fade entirely. In her small voice, he heard relief, trust, and the faintest glimmer of hope, the understanding that his choices could ripple outward beyond the immediate struggle, that a single act of mercy could restore something essential in the human spirit. Her words carried a weight he would never forget, the proof that decency had a life of its own, capable of sustaining more than just a single night. When Ethan finally prepared to leave, Kenji stood at the doorway once more, but this time his posture was different. He drew himself tall, back straight, eyes steady, and bowed deeply to the soldier who had restored not only his family's safety but his own peace of mind. This time he bowed not in shame, not under the crushing weight of debt, but in quiet acknowledgement of a promise fulfilled, of honor preserved, of life reclaimed. Ethan returned the bow, feeling the echo of that gesture ripple far beyond the walls of the shelter, beyond the island, beyond the war itself. In that simple exchange, There was an understanding that the choices made in a moment of crisis could resonate through lifetimes, shaping not only the immediate survival of a family but the enduring possibility that human decency might prevail, even in the shadow of war's darkest nights. When the war finally ended and the islands of the Pacific quieted, Ethan Cole returned to a world that had moved forward without him, yet could never erase what he had witnessed. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, offered him a path and he took it, enrolling in medical school, driven by a single enduring purpose: to save more lives than war had taken. Every patient he treated, every hand he steadied, carried echoes of that night in Okinawa, the memory of a mother restored and a daughter who had whispered her fragile gratitude. He wanted to ensure that no one under his care would feel the helplessness he had seen in Kenji's eyes, that he could extend the same mercy he had been called to deliver in the shadow of bombs and fear. Becoming a doctor was not merely a career, it was the continuation of the promise he had made without words, the long arc of kindness stretching from a ruined shelter to a lifetime of healing. Yet memories do not fade easily. Even in quiet hospitals, in the hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of antiseptic, the war lingered. The weight of decisions made in moments of despair, the faces of civilians whose lives depended on his courage, sometimes returned without warning. Ethan carried these memories with him, a silent burden as real as any physical scar. Psychologists would later identify it as moral injury, the kind of trauma that comes not from being shot or shelled, but from standing at the intersection of duty and conscience, knowing that every choice has consequences that ripple far beyond one's understanding. Some scars live in silence, hidden beneath steady hands and calm eyes, yet they shape the way a man moves through the world, reminding him that mercy and responsibility are inseparable companions. Years later, long after the smoke of Okinawa had dissipated, Ethan wrote a letter he never sent. He addressed it to the Nakamura family, to Kenji and Aiko, who had changed him more than he could ever express. In carefully chosen words, he thanked them for teaching him what humanity truly meant, for showing him that honor and kindness could coexist even in a world governed by destruction. He did not write of the horrors nor of the impossible choices, but of gratitude, respect, and the enduring lesson that decency is not a privilege but a responsibility. The letter remained in a drawer and signed, unsent, yet it was a private testament to the truth that had guided him through decades of practice in life, that even amidst the darkest war, the light of compassion could illuminate a path forward, shaping a man's soul as profoundly as any battlefield shaped his body. The lessons of Okinawa did not end with the ceasefire or the surrender of Japan. They lingered in the minds of soldiers who had seen not only destruction, but the fragile persistence of humanity amid chaos. For Ethan Cole, and for countless others like him, it became clear that war was never truly about victory. It was about decency, the capacity to uphold what is right even when every surrounding impulse screams otherwise. The choices made in the ruins of a single shelter could resonate farther than the blast of artillery, shaping not just lives saved, but the moral compass of a nation. The smallest act of care, the protection of dignity in a world gone mad, became the real measure of strength, the quiet proof that America's power lay not only in its guns, but in the courage to remain humane. Humanity itself became a form of American influence, a lesson reinforced again and again in the years that followed. Programs like the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe from devastation, or humanitarian missions that brought aid to famine-stricken nations, demonstrated that America leads best when it lifts, not crushes. Ethan's actions in that small Okinawan shelter were a microcosm of this principle. Power tempered by compassion, victory balanced with mercy. The soldiers who returned home carried more than medals. They carried the understanding that true leadership is measured not in conquest, but in care, and that the same hand that can strike can also save. The story of that night did not always appear in official records or history books. Veterans spoke of it quietly, often to each other and sometimes not at all. They did not recount battles won or lost or maps of territory seized. They spoke of people, the civilians who had taught them lessons no training manual could convey, the families who had survived because a soldier chose decency over impulse, mercy over mandate. These were the moments that lingered in letters and diaries, in subdued reunions and quiet reflections, carrying the weight of memory that informed each veteran's life long after the war ended. Every time they shared the story, whether aloud or silently in their minds, they reminded themselves and others that the greatest impact of war is often measured not by destruction, but by the acts of humanity that endure beyond it. And from these quiet recollections emerged an enduring philosophy, one that transcended individual battles, theaters of war, and the lifetimes of the soldiers themselves. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. It is a principle that defines the nation at its best, a compass that guides policy and action, a beacon for citizens and soldiers alike. Ethan Cole understood it in the eyes of Kenji and Aiko, and he carried it through decades of practice as a doctor and a human being. Decency, compassion, and moral courage are the threads that weave the fabric of a stronger, wiser America. In the ashes of Okinawa, in the quiet moments of choice and conscience, the legacy was born, that no matter the cost, humanity must prevail, and in doing so, America remains true to its highest calling. Ethan Cole often returned in his mind to that night in Okinawa, to the weight of choices made in darkness and silence. He remembered the trembling hands of Kenji, the still, resigned posture of Aiko, the tiny gestures that carried the magnitude of life and death. Those moments were etched into him more deeply than any battlefield or firefight, a reminder that courage often manifests not in the force of arms, but in the quiet discipline of the heart. He reflected on the paradox he had lived, that an act as simple as returning supplies and offering words of reassurance could demand more moral bravery than storming a hill under enemy fire. Those lessons became a compass, shaping every decision, every patient he tended, every life he touched. He carried home more than memories. He carried the enduring conviction that decency could survive even the most destructive conflicts, that kindness could coexist with war without weakening resolve. Letters unopened, thoughts unspoken, and silent prayers filled his nights, a quiet testament to the human lives intertwined with his own. He understood that the true measure of service was not in medals or commendations, but in the preservation of dignity, in the acts that required nothing from the world but honesty and courage. This story still matters because war will always test the limits of humanity. It is easy to measure success by victories and territories, but the measure of a nation, and of a soldier, is revealed in the choices that protect life, preserve honor, and honor conscience. Ethan's experiences are not relics of a distant past. They are a blueprint for moral action, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, humans can choose light over shadow, mercy over indifference. And so the night that defined a life is not just his, it belongs to every one of us who must navigate the moral landscapes of our own conflicts. Years later, Ethan would speak quietly of that night, offering a final tribute not to himself, but to the people who had taught him the profound lessons of courage and compassion. He honored Kenji and Aiko, their trust and resilience, as the living proof that small acts of decency can echo through lifetimes. He reminded those who would listen that the greatest victories are not counted in battles won, but in lives preserved, in dignity protected, and in hearts touched. And for us today the message is clear. In every conflict, whether across oceans or in the quiet struggles of daily life, the opportunity to act with humanity remains. Choose it. Uphold it. Protect it. Remember that under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us in preserving humanity in every challenge we face. Share these lessons, honor the lives touched by courage and kindness, and let them inspire the choices you make today. Because in the end, kindness wins, and it is the legacy that endures far beyond war.